Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to this webinar session entitled #SurvivorSpeaks, a panel discussion highlighting survivor voices. My name is Sheba McCants and I'm the Program Director for Education and Awareness for NCADV. And today I'm joined by Pat Silvala, Business Manager for NCADV. I actually wanted to share a photo of my twin boys. I just had twins 5 months ago. And so I just wanted to share that as just a little fun thing and just something to know about me. I was gone for a couple months on maternity leave, but I am back now and very excited to be here. But those are my two twins and they're just 5 months old today. So hi, hello from the twins. All right, so let's talk about how to participate in today's webinar. I'd like for everyone to take a moment to locate the questions box in your control panel. At this time, you can actually download some of the handouts. We also have a copy of the PowerPoint, a certificate of participation, as well as other handouts that have been provided by today's panelists, and those can be found in your control panel under handouts. Also, if you have a question for any of today's panelists on today's webinar, please feel free to submit those via the questions box. And that's where everyone is typing in their chats right now and greeting me. So thank you so much. That's the questions box. If you have a question at any time, type it into that box and I will be moderating that box. A reminder also that this webinar is being recorded. We will send it to you along with all the handouts in a follow-up email that will come out 24 hours after today's session, so tomorrow. And then also, we have a quick 5-question survey after the webinar for you to fill out. As soon as you exit today's webinar, that survey will pop up automatically for you. All right, this slide is all about social media, so #SurvivorSpeaks. So we'd love to see some traction on that hashtag today. So please do follow NCADV on Twitter and Instagram at NCADV and use the #SurvivorSpeaks. I'd also like for people to follow today's presenters. We've got @finding.our.voices on Instagram. We've got @Domestic Violence Action Center. We've got @HavenMT and @Rebirth_Journey on Instagram. So please do follow all of our presenters as well as NCADV on Instagram and Twitter. And feel free to tweet along with today's webinar using the #SurvivorSpeaks. All right, so let's begin today's panel with a series of polls. Who is participating today? For this poll, you can select multiple answers. So go ahead and select all that apply. Are you a domestic violence or sexual assault advocate, a victim or survivor, part of the law enforcement or legal community, a case manager or counselor, or other? And go ahead and type into the chat box what your job description is, or if it's not already represented there, go ahead and type that into the questions box. I'll read some of those out. We like to see active participation throughout our webinars, and this is the way that you can do it. So let's get as many responses as we can in right here in the beginning. I'll give you just a couple more moments here before I read out the results. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and close that out. Thank you all so much for typing in your responses. 67% of today's webinar audience has indicated that they're either a domestic violence or sexual assault advocate. 29% have identified as a victim or survivor, which is probably one of the highest that I've seen. So thank you all so much for joining us. And we hope this webinar is informative and inspiring. 27% are case managers or counselors, and then I'll read out some 4% from the law enforcement and legal community, and I'll read out some of the other jobs that descriptions that people have sent in via the chat box. So we've got a CPS investigator. We have a friend of a survivor and a church leader, a group facilitator for perpetrators, a community outreach national officer, wonderful, wonderful, a volunteer coordinator, a project director, policy advocate, a gun violence prevention advocate, communications manager, great, a sex educator through, wow, fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's go ahead on to the next poll. Where are you located? Are you tuning in from the West Coast, Alaska or Hawaii? From the East Coast? The Midwest? The Southern states and Puerto Rico? Or the mountain region? All right, looking good. Thank you all for the great participation. We can close that one out. 43% of today's webinar audience is tuning in from the East Coast, 26% from the Midwest, 17% from our southern states and Puerto Rico, 8% from the West Coast, Alaska and Hawaii, and 5% from the mountain region. Great, thank you all so much. We'll go on to the third poll of 5 total. What is your racial or ethnic identity? And you are able to select multiple answers, so go ahead and select all that apply. American Indian or Alaskan Native, Black, African, African American or Caribbean, Hispanic or Latinx, white or Caucasian, Asian or Pacific Islander. A quick reminder, if you have not already found where the closed captions are, I did type those into the chat box and they are going. So if you need captions, they are active right now in the webinar. So go to the questions box and you can find those in the welcome message, the link to the closed captions. All right, we can close that one out. 72% of today's webinar audience has indicated that they are white or Caucasian. 19% are Black, African, African American or Caribbean. 12% Hispanic or Latinx, and 3% for both American Indian or Alaskan Native, as well as Asian or Pacific Islander. Thank you so much. All right, our fourth poll. How would you define your community type? Are you tuning in from an urban community, a suburban community, or a rural community? Let's get a few more votes in. All right, that looks good. 43% of today's webinar audience is tuning in from a rural community, 33% from an urban community, and 24% from a suburban community. All right, and this is the 5th of 5 polls, so our last poll for today. How has your organization worked to amplify survivor voices during this Domestic Violence Awareness Month? Select one. Having a survivor speak at an awareness event, sharing survivor stories via social media, or other. And go ahead, like the previous question, go ahead and type in how your organization has worked to amplify survivor voices during this DVAM. I'd love to hear some of the ideas that you all have had and the ways that you all have done that during this DVAM. So, and I think it would be informative for others to hear about it too. So go ahead and type those into the questions box if you know of some other ideas. Very good. I'm seeing some ideas come in. Keep those coming. All right, let's close that out so I can have some time to read some of these. All right, great. So 42% said that they have had a survivor speak at an awareness event. 31% have been sharing survivor stories via social media. And then I'll read out some of these just, to share out some of the ideas. Great. So I see a survivor art show. That's really cool. A law enforcement training from a victim's point of view. Very interesting. An organization did a candle lighting. That's fantastic. Another person has a podcast, so they're sharing survivor voices through a podcast. A movie and Q&A, which is always an awesome thing, very engaging. A domestic violence awareness conference. Very good. I'm loving some of these ideas. Other social media posts to boost awareness. They're handing out treats at a local trick-or-treat event. Very cool. Displaying survivor artwork in the community. Excellent. So this has been excellent participation so far. I welcome all of your questions. I'll try to get to as many as possible, but knowing that this is a larger webinar, be patient with us if we are not able to get to all of your questions. But throughout the webinar, throughout the panel, feel free to type those questions into the questions box. And we'll also have a dedicated time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. All right, so at this time, I would like to introduce today's webinar panelists. First, we have Patricia McLean, a photojournalist and founder of Finding Our Voices, Breaking the Silence of Domestic Abuse, a project with a touring multimedia exhibit that launched in 2019 of women from all walks of life standing up with photo portraits and speaking out with edited audio about the domestic abuse in their lives. Let's welcome Patricia. Next, we have Nancy Creedman. Nancy is a co-founder of the Domestic Violence Action Center and has been working for 38 years addressing domestic violence. She has served on many committees through appointment by the governor, chief justice, mayor, and attorney general. Nancy has been published and interviewed by press and qualified as an expert in state and federal court. In 2016, Pacific Business News recognized Nancy as a woman who means business industry leader. In 2014, Nancy received the Ho'okele Award from Hawaii Community Foundation and Wallace Alexander Gerbaud Foundation. Nancy was selected by the YMCA as a woman leader in 2010 by the YMCA, and the Patsy T.K. Mink Foundation in 2018 recognized her with the Giraffe Award. Let's welcome Nancy to the webinar. Asia Desmond. Asia is the program director at Haven in Bozeman, Montana. She has a master's degree in global youth and family development from the University of Montana and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in sculpture. She has worked in various nonprofits for the past 19 years and is happy to call Montana home since 2008. In her spare time, she hikes and hangs out with her cat named Jean-Luc Picard. Let's welcome Asia. Janessa Rivera is a first-time author and owner of Rebirth Journey LLC, providing seminars and workshops on various topics of abuse in hopes to educate the community to prevent the repetition of the cycle and epidemic throughout future generations. She holds a bachelor's from William Patterson University in sociology with a concentration of social services and a master's from Grand Canyon University in professional counseling. She has worked in the social services field, working with the low-income community, including women who have identified as domestic violence victims and survivors for 10+ years. So without further ado, let's have all of our panelists go ahead and share their webcams, and we'll get this panel started. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Great, so that's everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you coming out and lending your voice to this webinar. And we hope that our guests today find it very informative. So let's go ahead and get started with our first question, which is going to be directed at all of our panelists. So I'll kind of go down the line and I'll moderate who, I'll just kind of call on you, and I'll have each of you respond to this first question. So, inspired by the hashtag #MeToo movement, in 2018, NCADV introduced a similar concept and media campaign focused on domestic violence, which we called #SurvivorSpeaks. The goal of this hashtag is to amplify the voices of domestic violence survivors. #MeToo showed us that cultural and social change is obtainable when the conversation is made accessible to all. Our hope is that #SurvivorSpeaks will empower survivors to come forward with strength and share stories that need to be told, which will continue to bring awareness to this issue that impacts millions. In the spirit of #SurvivorSpeaks, from your perspective, what are some of the most pressing issues affecting or facing survivors today? Let's start with Asia.
I think that the response to and the general sort of isolation that can happen in specific abusive situations really can be a barrier to connecting with other survivors. And I think when that connection can happen and those stories are shared, um, and I think we saw this with #MeToo, is the response is not always well received. That story is not always well received. So it can be really vulnerable and really scary to do that. And I think that certainly can be a barrier to the sort of cultural tidal wave that we can see with hashtag movements.
Thank you. What about you, Janessa? What are some of the most pressing issues facing survivors today?
I would say I would have two major things that I would contribute to being a problematic issue that we face. One of the things is that we constantly have to prove that we are a survivor or prove that we were a victim, because society only realizes abuse to be one or maybe one and a couple of other different things, when there's so many different forms of abuse. For example, the narcissistic abuse, which I have the handouts to, a lot of people don't identify or even know what that means. So for me to say I'm a narcissistic abuse survivor, I have to educate you, prove to you, and if I don't look like, or if we don't look like what, I'm sorry, are you getting me? If we don't look like what you think an abuser is, then I have to prove to you and basically tell you everything I'm not comfortable yet to tell you. That's definitely a pressing issue.
Indeed, yes.
And the other thing I would say is continuing with your everyday life. For example, my abuser was my ex-husband, but we co-parent by court order. So continuing life and as a parent, choosing to co-parent or parallel parent while healing yourself and identifying your triggers and doing all the things you need to do to be a successful survivor and a thriver and no longer a victim. That's very hard for our community, because some women or men have to choose, what do they do first? Heal and transform from victim to survivor, or co-parent and continue to exist in society with these abusers. Sometimes you have to do both simultaneously, and it's very hard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it's like, living in a double consciousness, or living sort of two identities as a survivor, but also, the many hats that many of us wear in the community as professionals or as parents, or, or what have you.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Nancy, how about you? From your perspective, what are some of the most pressing issues facing survivors today? I don't think we have your audio. Just unmute.
How about now?
Okay, great. We got you now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries.
I've got a couple of thoughts about that. One is, at least in our community, the persistent lack of understanding by the community about the complexity of challenges facing survivors. Our community tends to see it as sort of like a simple, why doesn't she leave thing, without really appreciating how complex it is to name it, overcome it, seek support for it, face the victim blaming. Victim blaming is still a huge barrier in our community. I think each community is a little different, but I think there's some things that are similar across communities. One other thing I would say, again, that we see in our community a lot, is the myths and misconceptions that people cling to about abuse still interfere with the community's ability to see what survivors need and what is in the best interest of the community as a whole. So the belief, for example, that domestic violence only happens in certain kinds of families, in certain kinds of communities.
Sure.
We have to still work to overcome those kinds of things in order to bring peace to our island families and to our survivors.
And just so people know, you're tuning in from where today?
I'm tuning in from Honolulu.
From Honolulu, Hawaii. Thank you so much for being here. All right, Patricia, how about from your perspective? What are some of the most pressing issues facing survivors today?
I think one of them is shame. We're ashamed that how could a smart woman like me be pulled into this? And I also think minimizing is a big problem. I feel that women minimize the abuse that they suffered, and they'll think, well, it's not as bad as someone else may have had, and they will also minimize it because it's their husband or boyfriend, and they'll see it as a relationship issue. Well, he's just like that sometimes, and they'll make excuses for him, and they won't see it as domestic abuse and themselves as a domestic abuse victim.
Sure. So identifying as a victim is a challenge.
Yeah,
and
that's a big deal. Yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else that you can think of as in terms of the most pressing issues?
I have one thing to add. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I was just going to say, in our community, there's a kind of complacency that has set in. Like, oh, we handled that in the 90s.
Oh, okay. It's like, oh, we've taken care of that. That's an issue that's been solved already, or something like that.
Right. We're moving on to climate change, or other things. We've addressed that already.
Yeah. Well, and domestic violence has that ability to sort of to go under the radar if it's not being addressed publicly. It's such a persistent issue, but if it's not being addressed in a community, it can kind of fly under the radar. And I think some people are surprised when they do hear about how prevalent it is.
And I have another thought, is that since it's in a relationship, and sometimes it may be in a marriage, a lot of people feel that marriage is sacrosanct, so that let's say you're just, if it's a friend and the friend was abusive to you, your friend might say, hey, that person's not treating you very well. But if it's a husband, they won't say, they won't criticize your husband to you, and you won't criticize someone's husband to them, because it seems like once you're married or in a long-time relationship, it's kind of like your issue, and whatever's happening in the relationship is something that you figure out how to make things work, and people sort of stay away from that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a bit taboo to say something negative about somebody's intimate partner. It seems a bit sort of intrusive or something like that. Yeah, very good points. And I'm sure that there will be many other, this question will kind of weave itself, I think, throughout the remainder of the panel questions. But at this time, I'm going to start directing questions to specific panelists. And I want to let all of our panelists know that if I'm directing a question at an individual, after they've made their remarks, feel free to also, raise your hand or let me know that you would like to also share some remarks on that person's question. So I just want to let you know that you have the ability to do that. You can kind of lend your voice to another person's specific question and weigh in as you see fit. And also just a reminder to the audience that there will be a live Q&A at the end after we cover a few, and we'll try to cover as many questions as we can there. All right, so I'm going to start with Patricia. So what would later become the photojournalism project called Finding Our Voices, it began when your personal experience as a survivor of domestic violence made national headlines, but that was only the beginning. Can you tell us more about how your story becoming public led to Finding Our Voices and the effect that your project had on your community?
I've lived in my community in Maine for 30 years, so I know a lot of people, and a lot of people know me. And when the story did break in the media, of my husband of 29 years arrest. What happened, it was strange because while I was married, he always told me, if anything bad happens to us, if we ever split up, basically, people are going to be, mocking us, and they're just going to be gloating. That's the word he used. He was gloating. But what happened when he was arrested is I got a ton of support from my community. But also, everyone around me, so many people came up to me and told me about the domestic abuse in their lives. And this was my hairdresser, my esthetician. It was a friend that I had known for 30 years. We had been really, really good friends. It was a lady that owned the market up the street. So that's when I realized, wow, like there's so much of this going on. I never had any idea. And I never knew that about all these people. They never knew it about me. And I just thought, I have got to lift the veil for other people too, so other people can see how much of this there is all around us. And I am a photographer, and I immediately thought of a photography project. And I Googled and I looked to see what photography projects were out there about domestic abuse because I didn't want to repeat something. And what I saw was, first of all, I saw Donna Ferrato's project, Black and White, from 25 years ago. I don't know if you're all familiar with that, Living with the Enemy, but it's the sort of poster child still for domestic abuse, and it's a woman with a black eye. And I thought that woman was very pitiful, and that's the kind of photograph that she had. And I was like, no, I don't want to buy into this stereotype. And then the other thing was that, the other thing that happened was a lot of times the women's faces were hidden. So their faces were not showing. And I thought this was such a shame. Like when you see, no faces, it just makes it like we've got something to be ashamed of. So that's when I thought, I'm going to do something where the women are standing up, and speaking out and not being ashamed. And this will be inspirational to other women to see that we got through it, and also to see that it's every woman. Like it happens to everyone. It doesn't just happen to a certain kind of woman. It happens across the board. And I debuted this in our Camden town library. So people walked into the library. There were at the time 15 portraits of women, and every woman, the criteria was we had to show their face, so it was their full face. And then it was a audio clip of them talking about the abuse in their own voice, and it was a power and control wheel that each woman individualized, customized. And it was very powerful because there were about 9 of the women were women from our community. So people walked into that library, they looked around, and the faces were they didn't look like pitiful women. We looked like strong women in the picture, and it upended a lot of stereotypes.
Absolutely. And you can actually find these portraits, the audio clips, as well as the individualized power and control wheels on your website, which we are going to share, which is findingourvoices.net. So I do encourage, did I get it right? I got it right.
The audio is also, yeah. And the audio of the women is also on the website for each woman.
Yep. It's really,
we're 20 women now. It's up to 20.
Wonderful. So I do encourage everyone on the webinar to check that out. We'll send that out also via the follow-up email, but it's definitely a powerful tool using photography, audio, and then looking at a power and control wheel and having people sort of circle and highlight and write things and really, really focus on how their abuse impacted them in terms of that tool, the power and control wheel, which we're all very familiar with. So definitely check that out.
The amazing thing in that is you see the similarities. Like there's 19 women, and it's the same thing. For all 19, basically, they're highlighting the same things. And that's what makes people realize the deliberate steps, right, that all these guys use to pull you in. It's all the same.
Very much. Thank you. All right.
Nancy. I wanted to just add one thing about using photography. We did a project here in Honolulu called Anatomy of a Survivor's Journey. And we got a grant and gave digital cameras to 10 survivors and asked them to take a series of photographs that had meaning for them, places that they had been or moments in time. And we also displayed them for the public to see. And they included a little, a short narrative, a sentence or two to describe the meaning of the photos. It's very powerful. It's hanging in our offices now, so everybody who comes to the agency gets to see the work.
That sounds very powerful.
It's really a powerful.
That really pulls people in, and just to see the individual experiences and to sort of be able to relate to that person and understand their journey. That's very powerful.
Yeah, it was.
Absolutely. And thinking about like what that looks like from their perspective, that's a very unique opportunity that you had there to give them the cameras so they could show.
Well, you're giving them a voice by doing that, aren't you? You want to hear what they have to say and how. So that's I love that.
Great. All right. So Nancy, so you are a CEO of a domestic violence agency in Honolulu, Hawaii. So I wanted to ask you, when it comes to impacting your community's understanding about the complexity of domestic violence, what role do survivors play in shifting perception and conveying the need for change?
You know, we had sort of come to a place in our community related to enough with the professionals talking about domestic violence and using our experiences with survivors. And we serve quite a few survivors every year. So we had the voices of survivors, you know, running through our veins and in our consciousness. But we came to the point where we realized that the survivors were needed in a much more active way to initiate reforms and shift perceptions and use their experience as persuasive tactics to address the inefficiencies in our system. So we created what we call a survivor action team. And we invited people who had received help from the Domestic Violence Action Center, who were no longer in crisis, had moved beyond their own danger, and wanted an opportunity to use their experience to give back and use their voice to impact the system that really hadn't served them too well. So we invited about 10 survivors, 10 women, to meet with us every week. We provided dinner, childcare, transportation, so that we could help them and help us figure out a way to influence our policymakers, our elected leaders, our appointed leaders, our law enforcement, our judges, our media, who were all sort of half listening to what we had experienced and what we knew to be the truth of the survivors we were helping, and provided an avenue, really, for us to work together to bring the message, because good intentions and good ideas sometimes just aren't enough. So the influence of the survivors who had actually tried to get help from the police or tried to get help from the courts could bring their personal experience to bear and influence the leaders in a way that were falling on deaf ears, if you will, kind of back to that complacency thing. Like, well, we've seen you around for a while, and we know you think the system doesn't really work that well, and what we needed was everybody to stand up and rise up and speak up about, well, yeah, the system's really not working that well, and we have to tell the story through the press. The media is very, very generous with us here in Honolulu. They cover everything. They tell the stories. They interview us. They feature stories quite a bit. So we wanted voices of survivors to be telling the story.
Janessa, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, I like to comment. I'm from New Jersey, and I've worked in different capacities in government as well as in nonprofit, from the southern tip all the way to the northern tip of New Jersey. And definitely you have a lot of organizations that band together in shelters and women's centers that do a lot of things. And I feel that more of their role is education and providing resources to women or men who identify themselves as being in a domestic violence situation. And the focus is more on either education to identify that that's what it is, as well as learning how to escape that situation. And then there's support groups for those that have not escaped yet and those that did escape. However, I think that the survivors have the role or responsibility to teach the community the things that the organization cannot do past 9 to 5. So the survivors should have the responsibility to teach the community life after, right? Because we're no different than a veteran that has PTSD for the rest of their life. We have triggers the rest of our lives. Like I mentioned before, we may have to parent with the person that was the abuser. We may have to work in the vicinity of other abusers, and now they may not have been our abuser, but they're an abuser, and we're getting triggered because of the same mannerisms they may have. Maybe they're our boss, maybe they're our coworker. So I do believe survivors have the responsibility to educate our community and society outside of the 9 to 5, right? So I like to say the 5:01 p.m. to the 8:59 a.m., the hours that the organizations are not open, and survivors should be the resources and the tools to say, this is what it looks like after you escape, because in New Jersey, and I can't speak for all the states, but in New Jersey and all the states that I've gone to present, there isn't any resources for the after. How do you build your credit afterwards? What do you do? How do you learn? How do you say, now maybe you're a one-man band and you weren't, and that's why you stayed in an abusive situation. And 30 years from now, how do you deal with the trigger? And it's okay. It's not that you're living in the past, or, you may have friends or colleagues and say, oh, you're in such a better place now. You left. Emotionally, you may not be in a better place. It may take a long time. So I do believe that the survivors have the responsibility, because we are the case study. We are the model. We are the evidence-based information. We have the responsibility to be transparent to the community and say, there is a lot of things and steps that you have to do after you escape so that you don't relapse. I mean, it's no different than having a 12-step program as, someone who's in addiction. And then once you finish your 12-step program, you should really forever stay in a support group or have an accountability partner or a sponsor. They don't recognize that model for domestic violence, but we should. We should have something very, very similar, because we deal with it until we take our last breath, and that's really the truth.
I think it was first Patricia, and then I'll go to Asia.
Well, I just want to say a few things. I think what we do have is we have hotlines, and I didn't know this before, but if you're in Maine anyway, if you're a domestic abuse victim, you could call the hotline not just when you're afraid that he's going to break down the door, but years after, if you're feeling anxious. Also, a couple of other ways that he never leaves you alone, that you don't really leave the relationship sometimes. If you have child support, he can withhold it from you, and then harass you with legal action. And the other thing is Janessa, I just want to sort of comment on your word responsibility. Like, I found that there are women who will step up and are really happy to advocate and be a face of survivors. But then there's others who, do just want to move on, or they don't want to identify as survivors. So when you said responsibility, I was just wondering if you meant like that they have a responsibility to be public about their experience.
I don't think that, everyone isn't a speaker. So everyone doesn't have that responsibility to be an advocate or a voice. I'm just saying that survivors do have a responsibility to guide and do, for example, our children go to school and our teachers teach them, but I do think it's the parents' responsibility to take what the teachers do and expand it individually for your child, right? Because the teachers can only do so much in the classroom. So what I'm saying is these organizations for domestic violence, they're the quote unquote classroom for society. So the professionals, really, to me, are the survivors that know how they got to the next step. Everyone doesn't want to do it, and everyone cannot do it, and may not be the professional or specialist to do it. But I think if there is a community to do it and to quote unquote teach outside the classroom, outside of the organization, who better than survivors who want to advocate for that?
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
You know, that's what I meant. Of course, not everyone. I mean, realistically, everyone wouldn't be inclined to want to, and every survivor isn't at the capacity to be able to do that yet. You see what I'm saying? So, no, I don't want to put that burden on them, but I'm just saying overall, generally, the survivors are the ones who, quote unquote, would teach outside of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think there are a couple comments from the audience around that word responsibility, and I don't want to belabor it, but I just think that safety is a concern for some survivors, and so you know, their advocacy or their ability to speak out for the issue might look different if they're currently in danger or if they're currently being abused, and you know, so I think that you made a great point, Janessa. It's not going to look the same on every survivor. So thank you for clarifying that. How about you, Asia? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I'm also happy for the clarification. I was going to put a little pressure on the should language around responsibility. I think that can feel shaming if it's not a place that resonates with a specific survivor. And yeah, I don't need to belabor it either. I just am glad for that clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Let's keep it moving because there's a lot to say here. I know, and I just want to be able to get to everyone's questions, and then we'll just keep it flowing here. All right, Asia. So you are a program director at a domestic violence agency in Montana. So when it comes to creating meaningful programming for those impacted by domestic violence, why do you think it's critical that domestic violence advocates make a practice of stepping aside as the quote unquote experts in the field and embrace the impact of asking survivors what they need?
Yeah, and I'll start by saying at Haven, we operate from the empowerment model, and we treat every person as an expert in their own experience. And I think for us to assume solution or choices really kind of functions to perpetuate a power and control dynamic that survivors are often either have just left or are trying to navigate their safety within. And so it's crucial to create the conditions for the people we aim to serve to step into their own power and see their own choice, which oftentimes has not been something. And I think that dynamic can feel uncomfortable sometimes if a survivor has come from a situation where they haven't had choice or the power to make choice. And so operating from that empowerment model is hard sometimes, and it's absolutely vital to the healing conditions that we try to create at Haven.
Thank you. All right, Janessa, and you've mentioned that you are a survivor. So I want you, feel free to speak from that point of view if that feels comfortable. The focus of your advocacy is on college-educated professional women who are survivors of domestic violence. Can you talk to us about why you have decided to target this unique demographic of survivors?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I identified myself as being in an abusive relationship or a survivor, I was working with the population, and I would say that individuals who are educated tend to self-diagnose and self-help themselves more often than not. For example, if my children are sick, I go to the ER or the urgent care. If I'm sick, I figure it out myself, a home remedy, I look up what it is. Individuals who are so busy, are in a career, they just a lot of time don't have all that extra time to take care of themselves, or we put ourselves last, we prioritize ourselves last, and we also don't identify with the stigma or what society presents as domestic violence, right? So we mentioned earlier, I think it was Patricia that mentioned earlier, oh, that can't be us. It can't be something that I had went through. So in my field, I had come across a lot of colleagues that, we would have cooler water conversations, and we are all professionals, and, a spade is a spade. We all knew that we were in unhealthy relationships, not necessarily abusive relationships. We didn't identify it as that yet, but they were unhealthy, and then they were escalating to toxic relationships, which then escalated to abusive relationships. And we all knew this. We could easily sit in clinical group supervision and identify when the consumers came in with those red flags, but we tiptoed around it when at lunch hour we talked about our significant others, husbands or wives, having those same mannerisms, because you don't get in anyone's family, you don't get in anyone's marriage, you don't get in anyone's business, and they know better. So because of that stigma, I really wanted to create professional development workshops and self-help curriculum so that someone who considered themselves as working in the population or being someone that serves the population, they didn't feel stigmatized to have to go to like a self-help meeting or a women's center, or like me, I couldn't go to the women's center because I gave grants to the women's center, right? That was a conflict of interest, and you could only go to the women's center where you lived. I couldn't get help at the other county's women's center. I lived and worked at that women's center, and I worked for the state, so I couldn't even go to any other county women's center because the state provided money to all 21 counties. So where would I go? And I knew all of these people. We did professional development together, and we went to trainings together. So then there was another issue of confidentiality because we're peers, and did I feel comfortable? Would I have a rapport with them? So I felt that there was a gap in services, and not necessarily, anyone that has a therapeutic background. We know there's multiple forms of therapy. Going to therapy and seeing a therapist is just one form, but you should have multiple different forms of therapy to move through. And I wanted people, especially people like me, to understand that there's multiple ways to address being a victim and move to being a survivor and to thriving and to being educated. It didn't just mean having to go into the women's center, because if that was not an option for you, you still need to get help. You still want to be safe. You still want to move forward, whatever that looked like for you. And I knew in my community that was a gap. So that's why I wanted to work with that particular community, because I was that. My friends were that. My colleagues were that. And I saw it was just all too apparent with psychiatrists I met and lawyers that I met and doctors that I met. And I just couldn't believe that it was like a secret society, and I knew that it wasn't us. I knew it wasn't something in the New Jersey water, but I knew that it had to be dealt with. And I figured, why not? I'm listening to everyone, and I myself know what I would be comfortable with and what I wouldn't be comfortable with. So let me, quote unquote, create some type of pilot, right? So what would that look like? And to see if it would be comfortable for everyone else. And little by little, I had my peers, do the same thing that I heard many of us say recently. As Patricia mentioned with her advocacy, now I'm getting emails from people I never seen since kindergarten. I didn't know still followed me. Now I'm getting emails from people that are on a career pedestal 30 steps ahead of me, telling me that they learned something from me, or they purchased, this curriculum, or they received the handout to my workshop, and I had no idea, and they too identified, and it helps them. And you realize that this really is, I would say, I call it the silent assassin of our community. So I thought that I was tending to a big need in my community because we all identify our communities differently. I'm a Latina. I'm a woman. You know, I live in southern New Jersey, not northern New Jersey, so we have less resources in southern New Jersey than we do in northern New Jersey. It looks very, very different. The county that I work for doesn't even have a shelter. They don't even believe in shelters. So, you know, they place everyone in a hotel, and I'm not talking about a nice hotel. I'm talking about, you know, a shabby motel, if that. It looks like a hostel, and they're the largest county in New Jersey. And that's me professionally knowing the background of them from a professional aspect. And that's because that's my background. It's plenty of women that I come across. One of my best friends, she's in communications. She doesn't know anything about human services, social work, therapy. So sometimes if I tell her something, it's foreign to her. So we have a lot of professionals that are in other industries, but they're professional women. They're degreed women or men. And they're very well educated, but it's not normal to them because they don't know the day-to-day, the outs and outs. They don't know what's even going on or the rate of recidivism. They don't understand the retention or, you know, they look up statistics and they don't even realize. I'm sure we all look at statistics and we hate writing them down because we know they're not even accurate because a lot of things are not reported, you know. But if you have someone whose background's in communication, they're looking up the statistics as they're doing a research paper. They're blown at what they see. We're blown at what we don't see because we know it's even higher, you know.
No one reports this kind of thing.
Patricia, were you just
you know,
going to say something?
So I just want to say that no one reports this. So whenever I hear statistics also about incidents, I'm like, no, because domestic abuse is not reported.
Absolutely. So in helping our society, you know, like I said, the people that are not in our bubble, that don't do this day to day, whether professional or not, they are already amazed when they look at the statistics. But people that are in this world, we know those statistics are not even accurate. So we need to tell them that. That's a footnote that we have to give to them, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on a number of things. You brought it back to Nancy's points about how there is still this prevalent myth that there is a certain type of victim, right? Like that if you're a degreed woman or if you're a professional woman, you wouldn't be in that kind of a relationship because, you know, that wouldn't happen to someone like you. So we're still breaking down that myth. And yeah, I think there, and then you're also just talking about the lack of resources and how I also wanted to just mention that you did include a handout. So Janessa is an advocate and she has a number of different topics that she presents on, but did include a handout, and we have that available for you all on the webinar on narcissistic abuse. And then I also just want to point out her website, which is rebirthjourney.com. And that way you can find out more about all of her different trainings and the kind of work that she does. So I would definitely recommend checking out her website. We'll make sure to include that also in the follow-up email. But let's continue. I've got one more question for each of you, and I just want to make sure that I get to all of those before the end of our time today. So let's go ahead on. We'll go to Patricia. So in your Voices gallery, there are audio clips of each survivor sharing their story in addition to a portrait, as well as a photo of a power and control wheel, which we mentioned earlier, that has highlighted parts of it and handwritten reflections from their own experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you chose audio, photography, and the power and control wheel to amplify survivor voices?
Well, audio is really important because we're silenced. We're silenced and we're silent. I was silent for 29 years. And when a woman presents herself to me, or I meet someone and I know them when they decide they want to come up and be in the project, we talk on the phone a lot of times, and they'll talk for hours, and they'll just, they have so much to say because it's their first time, a lot of times, breaking the silence. There's a lot to say. And so the woman's voice is really important. And also, again, going back to the type of projects that I saw when I looked online, a lot of times it's a compendium of, so they don't want to put the name to the person, so they put like, what is it, you know, when they combine stories into one story. So I just to respect the woman, her voice, I just, wanted her voice out there. And Yeah, I think I already touched on before the why I had these other two things. But can I just make one comment to what you said earlier? So when you were saying about the stereotype, well, that's the photos also, by the way, because it's women, like it's an architect, it's a former news anchor, it's a woman who's in a shelter, like just across the spectrum. But two things that were interesting were in my exhibit, I have myself included, and a good friend of mine who I've known for a long time saw that, and she said, "Oh, he was doing that, to you like 20 years ago?" And he was like, she said, "But you're so smart, Patricia." And then the other thing that happened is a lady in our project, someone featured her in a newspaper column in our state, and she went into the library after that, her local library, and the librarian said to her, "I thought you would be embarrassed to show your face after the article." And it was an article about that she had been in an abusive relationship for 42 years. So just talking about how important it is to break the stereotype, get rid of the stigma, and that's what my project is all about.
Thank you so much. All right, Nancy, would you be able to talk to us about your organization's approach to elevating survivors within your community's discourse through the project called the Survivor Action Team? You did mention it a little before, but I wondered if you wanted to give us a little bit more information about that, and specifically, how are the experiences of survivors centered within the work?
So we had sort of reached an impasse. I mean, that's kind of a little bit of an overstatement, but we felt like we had reached an impasse in our community in terms of advancing the community's willingness to recognize the enormity and the complexity and the prevalence and the cost of the problem of domestic violence. And we were trying to persuade the community that safe families and safe women are at the core of a healthy community. Because everybody has this sort of idea that we're going to compartmentalize everything. Families are over here, and businesses are over there, and healthcare is over here, and law enforcement's over there. And so we thought we need a strategy to bring it all together. So I think I did mention that I asked our staff to take a look at the people that they had helped within the last year or so, who they thought were not in crisis any longer and were not in danger any longer, and would be interested in coming together and working with one another and working with us to push the envelope, if you will, push us further as a community. So we made contact with the people that our staff had recommended, and invited them to join us, and asked them to make a commitment to it, because it was going to take a little bit of time to build the relationships and build the strategy for surfacing the ideas and surfacing the voice and surfacing the opportunities to bring the truth. So we began meeting every week to share first the experiences. And as everybody has sort of alluded to already, the experiences were quite similar. Their encounters with the police were kind of similar. Their encounters with courts were kind of similar. Issues around visitation were kind of similar. And we started to kind of identify where the weakest links were in our community's system, and everybody felt the desire to talk about those weak links. So we started to generate opportunities. I mean, we don't go anywhere or respond to any media inquiry or facilitate any panel or any meeting without survivors being present who are comfortable sharing their experience and using their voice to influence other people. So we created this structure that would help us mobilize one another and mobilize the community, and, excuse me, and break the isolation. Each of us has already talked a little bit about the isolation and the victim blaming. And when we are together, it's maybe more palatable to face the shaming that is sometimes inevitable, or the victim blaming that is inevitable when we're kind of in it together. It's less isolating and less kind of embarrassing, if you will. So the new voices that we brought into our community's discourse and into visibility throughout the community really helped us engage our community in new ways with the new voices, rather than, because like has been said by others, I too live in a very small community, and once you tell your story is known and relied on in a way, which is a precious gift really to the rest of the community, because it's a touch point, and we wanted survivors' stories to be the touch point for, again, our elected leaders, our appointed leaders, our reporters, our judges, our child welfare workers, anybody, our foundations. Those voices have the potential to persuade in ways that up until the last 5 years or so had been really behind closed doors and had been silenced. And so we wanted to use the Survivor Action Team as a way to break the silence in a different way.
Very good. And I know that kind of work, it's not accomplished easily, to be able to center survivor voices and to make sure that survivors are their voices are amplified in all of those settings that you mentioned. So I give you all an applause for that, because I know that that's not accomplished simply, is what I'll say. All right, so I'm going to go through two final direct questions, and hopefully I'll get to some of those other questions that I wanted to direct to everyone. But we are, this is what happens on panels. It's hard to get through everything, so we'll just keep going. So Asia, I wanted to hear more about the End the Silence project, which is your organization's Speakers Bureau. Specifically, I'm wondering how you have found that listening to survivors' experiences told from the first person, how has that helped to break the stigma around domestic violence, or does it?
Yeah, so we had a consultant come in and work with us to really try to understand the issues that were facing survivors in our community. And the two that End the Silence addresses are the isolation and the stigma. So End the Silence is designed to increase connection and destigmatize. And so many of our panelists today have addressed that in lots of different ways. And I think that that's kind of how we're doing it in one way at Haven. So the people who are in End the Silence are actually the reason why I chose to work at Haven, and their bravery to tell their story in that first person narrative piece, and also I identify as a survivor as well, and so even increasing connection that way in that group, but then also within the community with other survivors. And I happen to be one of those people, which is incredibly powerful to see happen and witness the connection that these women have with each other in this group of about 20 now. So End the Silence, and I want to be mindful of time, so I won't go into the programmatic details, although I can very easily get caught in program things as a program director. we have small cohorts. It's an 8-week kind of training component where the survivors are learning the framework that they can sort of tell their story from. So it's things like the cycle of abuse, the power and control wheel, the sort of, we call it DV 101. So we hope to create a framework that that really sort of a house of mirrors in some ways, so that we can have our survivors that are participating in this program say like, oh, there's my story, and there's her story, and there's that survivor's story. And I know that has been a theme that has come up as well today, that there are so many common threads in the stories that we hear. And then the culminating event, after they go through the 8-week process of preparation and connecting and crafting their stories, the culminating event is our kind of annual fundraiser called Taste of Haven. And I think that punctuating that experience is really an important part of that program. And it gives the group a common goal. And it's not kind of an unending story. There's something to achieve kind of at the end of that 8 weeks together. And that seems to be a really important part of the program. I think that addressing the stigma component is really about who chooses to be on stage. I think another really important part, and this goes a little bit to what I heard Janessa talking about earlier, is that the self-selection piece of this program is as important as any part of it. The survivor who chooses to be in the program really has to be ready to tell their story, and they're the only ones that can know if that's true. And so we trust the survivor who wants to be a part of the program, and we never sort of force it. Like, that culminating event is not required. We're never kind of like telling someone how to tell their story, and really kind of centering survivor voices in that way. And so I think the destigmatization that happens is who's on that stage oftentimes challenges what folks think about as like what a survivor looks like. And I know that's sort of come up again, multiple times today as well. So do I think it does that? I think it does that to some degree. I think it probably needs to happen a million times over and over again all over our country for that to really, but in our little community, and, shout out to my like 5% mountain region folks, that's, I think we're doing our part, and we're partnering with as many people in our community and across the state as makes sense to sort of elevate and center survivor voices anytime they're ready to be heard.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I wanted to add one thing that I overlooked and that I've heard, us all say, and that is, it was our experience, and it's been our observation that, and our hope, that when survivors are speaking and they are the embodiment of the success of leaving and telling the story, and that serves the purpose of inspiring other people, other victims to make different choices, or know they have options, or take some chances that they might not otherwise have taken, because they are filled with hope, and they can see the promise of doing something different through the experiences of the people that they've listened to in our Survivor Action Team experiences.
All right, Patricia, I'll take just one last comment on this, and then we've got to keep it moving. We've only got a little time left together. It's been so rich so far. Thank you all.
Just to say that a lot of women, when you're in this situation, you think, I can never be on my own. I couldn't make it on my own. And so to have these women out there saying, yeah, I've been in your situation, I got out, and look at me now, as you said, Nancy, that's hugely inspiring.
Fabulous. All right, so Janessa, this will be the last question, and then I think we'll probably, I might take like a quick short response on one of the questions that I have for everybody, but we really touched on the other one. So anyway, Janessa, if you had to describe and understanding that every survivor is different, what does a path toward healing look like for survivors of domestic violence? And what does it look like specifically for survivors of color, who statistically are among the most impacted by domestic violence?
I would say the path for healing, the first thing that everyone needs to understand is there is no stop, right? It's an ongoing thing. So healing is an ongoing journey. I don't believe in ever saying an individual is healed. I like to say that the individual is healing, continues the healing, is successfully healing. So that's one of the things I would love for all, everyone that's listening, whether you're an educator, professional, a victim or survivor, to understand that it's an ongoing process that doesn't end. The most important thing I would say, or what it looks like, is never do I want anyone who identifies as a victim or survivor to believe that they were the cause of anything that happened to them. But I do want us, because I identify as being part of the community, to take accountability for maybe lack of discretion sometimes we had, or lack of following our gut instinct, or maybe not staying consistent with the thought that we had. I want us to feel more empowered with being okay with our initial thoughts, because I know a lot of us don't feel empowered, and that's what we need moving forward to become, to go from that victim mode to survivor mode. Is feeling that empowerment, whether we get it from ourselves or from others. I think that's very, very important, because if we flee one abusive situation, the goal is to not engage in another abusive situation. And in order to do that, we need to learn what works for us. What's our triggers, what is abusive to us, what makes us feel disrespected, because that may look very different to everybody. What does our self-esteem encompass, and the things that don't attribute to it? What do we consider unhealthy for ourselves? What's negative to us? What's toxic to us? And we really need to understand that it's not a cookie cutter approach. And 7 survivors in the room would never say the same 10 things. And it's okay for us to identify what's more important to us than, the next person, and work that way. So in order to successfully heal, I think we need to understand 2 things. Healing, there is no end point. It's an ongoing thing, and you need to be prepared to work on it consistently, even when you left, even when you're having good days. I also want us to understand that it's ongoing education, educating ourselves, what it looks like, identifying that, for example, what you did to heal from maybe 20 to 30 may not work for you anymore from 30 to 40. So you have to revisit what healing is for you. It's an ongoing thing. We outgrow healing mechanisms all the time, and that's okay. And I also want us to not be scared of what we want our future to look like. So we need to empower ourselves and engulf ourselves in being empowered, which means it's okay to be upset. It's okay to grieve when you're grieving. It's okay to be angry. All of the 7 stages of grief, right? A lot of victims and survivors have lost themselves in the process. So we need to understand that survivors have grieved themselves, or what they thought was themselves, or what they thought a marriage was, or what they thought a family unit looked like. We had ideas of something, and when we realized we were in an abusive situation and we were ready to go, a lot of those ideas died. And we as victims, now identified as survivors and thrivers, we need to understand that it's okay to grieve those things that we once thought. We don't have to pretend that it does not hurt us, that the definition we had for marriage is not what we no longer think it is. Because in order to heal, we have to first identify with what hurt us to heal, right? There's no healing if there is no hurt. So if you overlook the hurt and you don't process the hurt, which is the shame, the guilt, the embarrassment, the misconception of whatever it is that we came across, you need to identify that within yourself first. Not that you have to address it or be a vocal piece for everyone, but between you, yourself, and whoever you believe your higher power is, if there is one, you need to identify that within yourself so that you can create a new definition of what that looks like. So just using an example, for the longest time, I thought that having a family meant being married and having children. You know, that was a family. I always wanted a family. You know, my mom is one of 18, my dad's one of 6, I'm Latina, family's a big thing. We don't believe in divorce. I got divorced after 12 years of being with my abuser, and guess what? When I'm at work and I talk about my family, I still have a family. So I no longer identify having a family as being married and having those children. I still have the children, and I still have family. So my definition of family is different. And now, when I think of getting married again, I don't equate having a family because I already have a family. I equate marriage with finding a lifelong companion. So my definition changed. So in healing, that was part of my healing. And I feel like I had to change my mindset and continue to change my mindset. And that came with surrounding myself with other like-minded individuals, other survivors, a lot of education, empowering myself, and understanding that if today I'm upset, even though I've been separated for 5 years and divorced for 5 years, I can be upset about the things that happened to me that I haven't dealt with yet. Because, you know, Patricia said she was in it for over 20 years, 29, I believe. Do you know how many days are in 29 years? She might not have even thought about day 200, year 12 yet. And something may trigger her today. And she didn't deal with that yet. She didn't process with that yet. And we cannot, as a society, say to her, well, Patricia, you're so successful and you've been thriving and advocating for the community. Why aren't you over it? We can't say that because she didn't process that moment. And that will happen to all of us. And it's okay. So that is very important in the healing process. And everyone needs to understand that we will continue to learn and process new things and heal every day, even though we've healed and we're advocates for so many things. As we come across other people and are empowered by other things and cultivate our minds with other learning mechanisms, we're going to look at it to our own life and say, oh, wow, I haven't processed this piece of me yet. And that's a new journey to my healing.
Patricia, did you have a comment to that? Did your hand go up? Or was it no?
No. Go
Okay.
ahead,
It was Asia. Asia, did you want to respond to that one?
I just wanted to address the part of your question that I heard about survivors of color. And I am like a white passing biracial Latina. So I feel like it's important to just name that if survivors of color need to find affinity spaces that are aligned with those parts of their social identities, that can be really important. And whether you find affinity in survivorship or you find affinity in your like cultural or racial ethnic backgrounds, I just felt like I wanted to kind of name that and say, if you need to find your people outside of survivorship in that way, and find other survivors of color, I think that's really important too.
Thank you for adding. Thank you for really being specific about that. I think I have personally also found that very helpful, finding those affinity spaces where I can really show up as, you know, who I feel most comfortable being and who I am, rather than feel like I have to kind of switch up or change up in the way that I talk about this work. It's very personal to each of us. So, okay, so why don't we take a couple questions from the webinar audience, and then I think I'll wrap it up with our final question. So why don't I have our panelists thinking about one thing that they would say in terms of how friends, family, and allies of survivors can, what role they can play in the hashtag Survivor Speaks movement, and how can those folks continue to amplify. So think on that, but I'm going to take a question or two from the webinar audience. So why don't you go ahead and type any questions that you all may have into the questions box, and I'll moderate. I did have a couple that came in, so why don't we start with one of those? I think this is an interesting question. So one of the major issues that has been identified is the way that the media portrays domestic violence and victims. And the person who typed this in says, you know, in order for us to make a change in our community, we have to change the narrative. So how can we change the way that the media addresses domestic violence, and what role does survivors play in making that change?
You want to go first? Yes. I just want to give an example of something we did here because of our aggravation with the media. We hosted what we affectionately called a media summit, and we talked to our allies in the media, and we formed a panel of survivors whose stories had been covered by the media to explain what it felt like to have their stories told by our press, and help them understand when they tell somebody else's story, the words they use, the language, the descriptions, the repetition, all impacted their healing from the trauma that caused the media to cover them in the first place. So that was one thing that we did to try to have a more directed conversation with our media. I mean, we talk to them all the time, but to try to bring them together and sort of help them understand the language and the vocabulary and the experiences of survivors, we found pretty helpful.
Great. And was it Janessa that wanted to get in next?
Yeah, I'm actually glad Nancy said that. I do think that, you know, we do a lot of training on cultural sensitivity, but we should be training on victim sensitivity, which is something that I've done statewide here using the right language. But for New Jersey and Philadelphia and New York, because those are the regions that I get the news from, whenever I see the media portray DV in any light, it's always because something fatal has happened. I never get, there's DV walks everywhere. That's not publicized like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in Philadelphia. You know, they don't highlight that at all, which we should. And I feel like the media helps society to stay in the mind frame that domestic violence is only when someone dies or someone has been physically injured to the point that it's altered them physically, or has darn near had one of them lost their limb or something like that. The media also only talks about the celebrities that engage in domestic violence. So not celebrating the awareness, I believe that the media should, quote unquote, step it up. And also, it shouldn't always be the extreme case scenario, right? Because then that's why so many people that identify as survivors don't feel comfortable with advocating for DV. Not that everyone has the responsibility to, but more would feel inclined to if they didn't have to prove that they lost a limb or broke a rib in the process. You know, it could be so many other things. There's so many levels of advocacy that we need. But the media only talks about it in this worst case scenario. And a lot of times, in my perspective and in my point of view, it's always in the most urban area, and it's always the most gruesome case. You know, they don't talk about an affluent community where it's happened, it's always like in the inner city of Philadelphia where the mom was killed by the boyfriend and left 4 kids behind. Now the 4 kids are in Department of Children and Families, and then they move on to something else, you know. So I think that the media should definitely do better in covering all of it, the success, you know, the survivor walk, as well as covering that DV is not just a fatal stabbing between a boyfriend and a girlfriend.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Patricia.
I think that the media can also do a much better job of not giving a platform or maybe celebrities who have committed domestic violence. I'm thinking maybe Mel Gibson, when we found out about that from him, he did these interviews with TV people, and they didn't comment on that. And my ex-husband, John McClane, after he was arrested, since then there's so many puffball pieces on him, and they don't mention, you know, that he was convicted of domestic abuse, and that does a disservice to anybody listening or watching that interview to think that business as usual and it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. All right. So in the 4 minutes that we've got left, I'm going to go down the line of our panelists. I'm going to ask you in 1 minute or less. This is the only time I'm going to put a time limit on, just because we only have this hour and a half together, and I want to respect everyone's time. In 1 minute or less, could you tell us what role can friends, family, and allies of survivors play in the #SurvivorSpeaks movement? And how can we continue to amplify? We'll start with Asia.
Well, I don't want to throw another hashtag at you, but I do think that we start by believing women and we don't question their truth. We trust them as the experts in their own experience. I think as an ally, it's important to be intervening when it's safe at the bottom of the pyramid of violence. So, you know, whether that's calling out your friends when they're using objectifying language or insults and joke, like even we're going to see paradigm shifts when we're able to hold each other accountable at the bottom of that pyramid before we're seeing the escalation to the violence that we're all kind of working with every day and talking about here in this. So I'll leave it there, and I concede the rest of my seconds to the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Asia.
Sure.
Janessa, what can allies do it, and how can we continue to amplify the voices of survivors?
Keeping in the theme of hashtags, one of the hashtags I use a lot in my social media is reveal to heal. And going to another question that I mentioned earlier, I do think it's very important that we should reveal what we've been through in order to heal. So as I mentioned for my question, how do you heal? What does healing look like? It's okay. You have to process what you've been through and process all your emotions, the successes and the failures, the challenges and the barriers, all inclusively. And I believe that your friends and family and allies play a very big part in your circle of healing and your foundation of healing. Healing does not mean having to go to a professional and sit in therapy. Healing just means that you should be able to have a support group and a foundation where you can talk about your feelings, process your feelings, and just have that platform. Revealing what you've been through not only starts the conversation, it breaks the ice amongst other people. Revealing what you've been through helps you because you're healing and processing what you've been through, but it also gets the dialogue out there to other people that may not have access to a forum like this. So I think it's very important to do that with your friends and family because realistically, it's kind of a word of mouth. I'm a professional that knows about DV, but I also have personal experience. So telling my friends and family, now they heard it from me on both my professional and my personal experience. Now then when they hear something through their neighbor or their coworker or another family or friend that's not mutual with us, they now have some knowledge that they can pass on, right? So it's like telephone. They're taking some knowledge and passing it on and at least having a starting point to engage the conversation, and it's not taboo per se. So I think that's the role that they can play, because realistically, your friends and family might not be the one to help you move forward and be an advocate, but that's the role that they can play. They could be the olive branch for us to get the awareness out there.
Thank you so much. How about for you, Nancy? What role can allies and friends and family play?
I think I would want to, for this moment anyway, focus on asking community and allies to respect the ethnic and cultural and religious diversity and the values that drive people, without assuming that everybody is experiencing a similar thing or it's a similar pathway, that there are different norms and different expectations in different communities. We live in a very, very diverse community, and so we experience that quite, every day. So that the values have to be respected among different religious, ethnic, and cultural communities. So I think that's what I would want to focus on.
Thank you so much. And we're right at the top of the hour. Patricia, what role
I would say
friends, family, and allies play?
I would say with Janessa, I'm with her on this. I think just a simple me too. If you don't need to say anything more than that, but just me too, and that goes a long way.
And I'll just close it out by saying, listen to survivors. And I really appreciate everyone on this panel giving us this opportunity to hear more about your experience, as well as the programs that you lead in your own communities. I really appreciate all of the active participation of all of the attendees. We've gotten some excellent just comments, questions flowing, and this is just such an excellent opportunity for us here to spend some time together during Domestic Violence Awareness Month to bring, to highlight survivor voices. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate your time. To all of our excellent panelists, thank you very much. And I'll wave goodbye to you for now. And I wish you a great rest of the month here. October can be a very busy month for all of us. So thank you all so much for what you have offered today. Just a couple of very brief announcements. Next month's webinar is on Tuesday, November 12th, and it is going to focus on vulnerable brains in survivors of intimate partner violence, so screening, strategies, and solutions. All attendees will receive a follow-up email tomorrow, and that's going to contain a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as links to all of the handouts and the certificate of participation. And then lastly, help us improve. We'd love to hear from you all. We always try to continue to improve our programming, so please fill out the 5-question survey as you exit out of today's webinar, and we thank you in advance for your feedback. Have a wonderful rest of your Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and thank you all so much for joining us today.